Hello, everyone, and welcome to Literary Tales. I'm your host, Paul Krause, and in this episode, we begin an exploration of the great books of American literature, grounding our study with J. Hector St. John de Crevecoeur's Letters from an American Farmer in order to better understand the more seminal classics of the American Renaissance, The Scarlet Letter, The Last of the Mohicans, and Moby Dick. American literature, as a definitive and unique genre, begins with the publication of J. Hector St. John de Crevecoeur's Letters from an American Farmer in 1781. It is true that the wellspring of the Greco-Roman classics, especially Virgil and Cicero, along with the Elizabethan and Jacobean literary tradition, are carried over into the garden of American literature. But American literature, in its own distinct form, undeniably begins with Crevecoeur's declaration of the new man that is an American, with a boundless, innocent optimism governing his soul. Early American literature, then, in the intermediary stage of birth, say 1781 to 1820, is equally unique and exceptional for many reasons. It's also important to understand the archetypes established during this roughly 40-year period to better understand the classics of the American Renaissance. First, American literature gave prominence to female voices in an age when men were still the dominant literary voice. Susanna Rowson and Hannah Webster Foster come to mind as having written early classics that embodied the fervor of the new egalitarianism and republicanism in the aftermath of 1776. Second, many of these same female authors painted a portrait of the American woman as a new Eve in the New World. The maturation of American literature, however, is generally understood to have occurred around 1820 with the rise of Washington Irving and the publication of Rip Van Winkle and the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. In the 1820s through the 1850s, just prior to the American Civil War, we witnessed the flurry of literary activity that produced some of the treasured classics of American literature, like The Scarlet Letter, The Last of the Mohicans, and Moby Dick. This constitutes the beginning of the so-called American Renaissance, according to literary historians and scholars. In his seminal literary work, The American Atom, R.W.B. Lewis writes that the aftermath of the War of 1812 brought a euphoric feeling of the American people. This was, of course, the era of good feelings. Lewis writes, quote, "In the decade following the end of the War of 1812, an air of hopefulness became apparent in American life and letters. It expressed the sense of enormous possibility that Americans were beginning to share about the future of their new country. But hopefulness at the outset was combined with feelings of impatience and hostility," end quote. This hopefulness, however, is undoubtedly also contained in the writings of Crevecoeur, who famously boasted the new man called the American, once scattered all over Europe, now left behind him all his ancient prejudices and manners, receives new ones from the new mode of life he has embraced, the government he obeys, and the rank he holds. Crevecoeur's American is the idealization of Lewis's American Atom. The American that Crevecoeur fantasizes is one freed from the bondage of the past, human nature, and sin, those dark, ancient prejudices and manners that he spoke of when describing the American transplant having come from Europe and forsaking those ancient prejudices and manners that once constricted him on the old continent. Crevecoeur's American is boundless in his aspiration and opportunities, as Adam was in the garden before the fall. Yet Adam fell, and America fell too. Not long after the era of good feelings and the movement toward the great cataclysm of the Civil War, Ralph Waldo Emerson presented his famous lecture titled The Conservative, where he divided America into two parties, the party of hope and the party of memory. We may forgive Emerson for his lackluster and rather infantile characterization of conservatism as the prejudicial party of memory, but what Emerson underscored is relevant to the understanding of American literary culture and arts. Emerson, as a writer and intellectual belonging to the party of hope, found himself adrift in a cultural storm of memory and criticism. This idea of the land of hope, party of hope, and man of hope has two origins, as I can see it. First is the Pilgrim and Puritan religious optimism that led Cotton Mather to famously declare God as having a special providence for his New England Israel. Second is the political and economic optimism spelled out by Crevecoeur and energetically written about by Thomas Paine, the American socio-political economic tradition of writing. Yet the classics of 19th century American literature are decidedly against this naive and innocent, hopeful optimism that has long characterized American liberalism and the so-called American mind. Hawthorne, Cooper, and Melville are, by the dictates laid out by Emerson, partisans and writers of the party of memory, and critics of the naive optimism and innocence exuded by the likes of Emerson, Crevecoeur, and Paine. Plato said that all peoples and nations believe and need to believe in noble myths that give themselves meaning and a sense of purpose in life. American exceptionalism is but the latest iteration of this phenomenon we find among the Germans in their concept of Sonderweg, or the British idea of Anglo-Israelism, or of course the French idea of the French nation. This exceptionalism is, however, part of the American experience and tradition. Perhaps this is why the critics of hopeful innocence are so seductively powerful and enduring in ways that the optimists are not. On one hand, we see the traces of exceptionalism lingering throughout their works. On the other hand, Hawthorne, Cooper, and Melville kick the ladder of American hubris out from underneath us and remind us of the bloody and messy reality of our fallen world and fallen lives. In the subsequent episodes on the great books of the American Renaissance, I will discuss Hawthorne, Cooper, and Melville and highlight the themes of innocence lost in their works.